Now, before the vaccine, British pandemic policy was marked by repeated failures. But its vaccine rollout has become the envy of many other countries, especially those across the Channel. Kate Andrews joins us to bring us up to date with the latest stats. She's the editor of the Spectator's daily COVID-19 update newsletter, the only roundup you really need for the latest on the coronavirus pandemic in Britain and abroad. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. At yesterday's press conference, Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty said that the UK was past its peak of this wave of the virus. And as you can see from this first slide, the data really reflects that. Daily cases are now hovering around where they were in early December when England was coming out of its first lockdown. And as SpectatorTV watchers will remember from last week, we looked at hospitalization admissions in the UK, and those also appeared to be on a downward trajectory. But we were cautious, knowing that these figures can be revised upwards. But it's a week later, and if we look at this next slide, we can see that decrease in admissions very clearly now. Still, Chris Whitty warned yesterday that these figures were incredibly high in his words, and that the NHS was still at risk from suffering capacity trouble, what he deemed as extraordinarily fast in a bad circumstance. I'm going to come back to that point in just a minute, what these decreases could mean potentially for lockdown easing. But first, I want to look at the Office for National Statistics antibody survey. As you can see on this next slide, the latest survey shows 15.3% antibody prevalence in England. That's up from 10.7% last month. Now, back in the first wave, an increase would suggest higher case numbers and more circulation of the virus. This time round, infections are certainly playing their role again, especially with the more aggressive strain, the Kent strain of the virus. But the exciting news is that vaccines are also playing their part too now. As you can see from this next slide, the age breakdown is really remarkable. The highest antibody positivity in England is for the over 80s, who of course have been prioritized for the vaccine. Roughly 25% of that age group is now showing antibodies, and that's with a 95% confidence interval. Now, this latest survey runs 28 days leading up to January 18th, and we know that it can take several weeks for antibodies to kick in once you've had the jab. So this survey is really looking at the beginning stages of the vaccine rollout, which started on the 8th of December. It's accounting for maybe up to a month. But what's exciting is that if we consider the fact that what we're looking at here is showing the beginning phases of the rollout, that would suggest in the next survey, we could be seeing some extraordinary figures that are taking into account the millions of people who have been getting their jabs and building up antibodies. And the ONS is going to be releasing these surveys fortnightly now, so we're going to get to see that vaccine factor play out soon. All of this bolsters the narrative that the UK's procurement process and rollout of the vaccine has been right. It's gotten its strategies right. A story which Katie Bowles has written up in the magazine this week, and I know is going to be discussing in detail in a little bit. Between the four nations, as you can see in this slide, we've reached the 10 million jab milestone, and the UK is still on track to hit its mid-February target of the first 4 priority groups being vaccinated, and there's now talk of early April when the over 50s, that's priority groups 1 through 9, would be vaccinated. So what does this all mean for the easing of lockdown? Well, on the one hand, you had even more good news this week, the preprint of an Oxford trial published in The Lancet, which showed that the vaccine had a 76% efficacy rate. That's 6 percentage points higher than was originally thought, and crucially, that it seemed to cut transmissions by 2/3. Now, this last slide shows some SAGE modeling, which projected that vaccines cutting transmissions by over 50% could get deaths to near zero around April. Though hospitalizations might trail this, as under 65s make up roughly 65% of those in the ICU right now, of course they are more likely to recover. But there's a catch in this slide. It's also assuming September-style restrictions. That means major social distancing rules still in place. That's certainly not what we would call normal. So as we hit these targets, mid-February, the most vulnerable being inoculated, hopefully by early April, the over 50s being inoculated, pressure is going to mount on politicians for society to start opening up. And there are major questions to be answered. How low do hospitalization and death rates have to be in order for us to meaningfully reopen? And what is the tolerance for risk? Health Secretary Matt Hancock told The Spectator just last month that once the most vulnerable were protected, that we were going to cry freedom. But whether the government is actually willing to make the case for freedom is a different story indeed. Back to you, Andrew.
Just before you go, Kate, there's been a lot of argument, mainly from the French, about the Oxford vaccine, and also some reports that you could get vaccinated with, say, Pfizer for the first dose, but a different vaccine for the second. Just tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. Those are two separate stories. The first is that there have been criticisms from European leaders about the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine. This is very strange given that the European Medicines Agency has approved the vaccine for all age groups, but there are still some leaders suggesting that we don't know enough about it to say whether or not it would protect the most vulnerable, i.e. those in older age groups. The good news from that preprint Oxford trial that we got this week is that the efficacy rate is thought actually to be higher than we originally estimated it to be. All the signs are still pointing in a positive direction for the Oxford vaccine. I think what you could take away as well is that the EU's desire to get more Oxford jabs into the bloc and their push to get a higher order is going to be slightly undermined by major European leaders, including Emmanuel Macron, suggesting they're not going to use it to inoculate their most vulnerable. Why wouldn't you then keep those jabs in the UK, where we are using it to inoculate the elderly? The second thing you mentioned, Andrew, is a voluntary trial in which they're going to look at what is essentially a vaccine cocktail. If you give somebody one type of jab first and another type of jab second, to see if you can increase its effectiveness. This is all going to be voluntary. Volunteers are going to know that they're part of this trial. It is not going to be carried out as part of the major vaccine rollout to make sure everyone's inoculated. So nobody needs to worry that that trial is being conducted on them when they get their vaccine. Everybody will know going into it that they're in that trial. And it's exciting, really. It could be a real discovery process. If we find out that mixing these vaccines together can get a higher efficacy rate, it means people are better protected.
Okay, the only unhappy person will be President Macron. But we don't really bother too much about that.